back to another week of Covenant Kids Sunday School. We're well on our way to finding out how the Bible all fits together and understanding how it all works and how it all brings us to Jesus and even eventually to us. So we're well on our way. So today we're going to be learning about a new person in the Bible. So right now we know that Moses has been leading the Israelites. And so where we left off last week, they crossed the Red Sea. And they rejoiced and they're excited and happy. So now they're traveling through the desert to the land that God promised them. So it's been 40 years. They've been wandering in the desert for 40 years. And now they're coming very close to the promised land. So Moses has now passed away and God has appointed a new leader to bring them into this promised land. And the person that we're talking about today, his name is Joshua. So the name Joshua means the Lord saves. So that's a pretty important name, right, to have, because you're going to save, right? So God has appointed Joshua to lead God's people into this special promised land. So like we said, they've been traveling in the desert for 40 years. So I can imagine, you imagine with me, you're surrounded by sand and just vast emptiness. There's nothing around you. Now, you may have known this, you maybe not. The people have been eating manna, which is a type of bread that God dropped from heaven, and quail, which is a type of bird. So that's what they've been eating for 40 years, because there's no other thing in the desert, just what God provided for them. So that's all they've been getting, and I'm quite certain they're quite sick of it. And they've been setting up tents. They live in tents. I mean, it's fun to go camping and stuff, but not all the time. And it's hot out there, so they're probably ready to be done with it all. And when they seen the edge of the promised land, I can imagine that they were so excited and ecstatic and just ready to go. But there was a problem. The problem was called Jericho. And Jericho was a city, but it wasn't just any city. It was a fortress. And it stopped anybody from getting into the land. So you couldn't get into, they had this promised land, but they couldn't get into it because Jericho, the fortress, was blocking the way. So what were they going to do? How are they going to get there? Well, they're going to have to conquer this fortress, right? So behind me you see is just a great big piece of wood or a board. So it's kind of like a massive door. Now, if you remember maybe some of these movies you've seen with castles or whatever, and they have what's called a drawbridge. So these huge pieces of door, I guess, would just come down and let the people in. Well, so this was just wood, but they had doors that were made of iron and steel, and they were just massive and huge. So there was just no way that you could just walk in or knock it down. But the only way that the people could get to the promised land was to get through these walls. So how would they do it? No one knew. How could they get through these huge, massive walls? Well, of course, you should probably know by now that God knew what to do. So God told Joshua what to do. But this was kind of a weird battle plan. And I'm sure when he told the people it too, they were just as confused and just as like, okay, are they going crazy? Cuckoo. This is not going to help us get through an iron wall. Well, God promised his people, said, I will be with you, and I will never, ever leave you. And if you do what I say, your lives in the new land will be happy, and everything will go well. So, what could they do? Gather their army and put this battle plan into action. So Joshua gathered up his army, and the army, they had all their spears and shields and all those things that they needed, their armor to wear for battle. But this wasn't a battle of fighting. So they didn't really need all that stuff. This plan was about trusting and doing what God wanted and asked them to do. So what did they have to do? They had to march. So they marched around the whole city walls. They marched, every single one of them marched around one time. And then the next day, another time. One time they marched around. And then the next day, one time around. Then the next day, one time around. Next day, one time around. Day after day for 6 days. They marched around the city just one time, just marching around. I'm sure the people of the city just thought, what in the world is going on? These guys are too scared to fight or something. But they weren't scared. They were waiting. The people were waiting for God to tell them what to do next. The next thing God asked them to do was to march. They marched again on day 7. They marched around the walls again, just like they'd done every day before that. But this time, they were asked to march again and again. And again, 7 times they were asked to march around that wall. And then on the 7th time, when God gave the command, he said, shout and blow your trumpets and make such noise that the walls will come tumbling down. Well, do you think they fell down? Let me see. I brought a little tiny trumpet. Do you think this will be enough? Let me try. No, the wall didn't fall down behind me. Maybe I should yell, praise the Lord! Well, it doesn't work for me, but guess what? Those walls fell down because God was there and he knew that they would trust him and he helped make it fall down because they did what he had said. And they crumbled to the ground and Jericho vanished in a cloud of dust. Well, the people went in and they took over. And then they were in their new promised land. Joshua led them in and they didn't have to fight in. They didn't have to fight because the walls fell. They could just walk right in. Joshua said, God has brought you safely here. Now will you do what he says? And the people said, we promise we will do what God says. Joshua said, only God can make our hearts happy, so don't pray to pretend gods. No, they said, we won't do that. But unfortunately, we all know that they didn't keep their promise. They didn't do what God said. And many years later, just as God warned them, things would go bad again. They would lose their home, enemies would capture them, and they'd be taken off as slaves, and God's people would be scattered into different lands. But God's plan was still working. One day, he would give his people another leader and another home. But this home, no one can take away from them. As you can see from the story, sometimes the strangest things God asks us to do don't seem possible, that's impossible. How could marching and shouting and yelling cause something to fall or the walls to break? But it wasn't about what they did, it was about how they trusted God. And we can be reminded of that too. If you trust God, no matter how weird what God's asking you to do may sound, if you trust him, he will always make the plans come out, and his plans will always be the way he wants them to be and the way they're supposed to be, and he will always be there with you. Just like he said to Joshua, I will be there, I will protect you. That is exactly what he can promise to us too.